You've probably heard this a lot over the past year or so. Space travel is boring, space is just empty, shallow as a puddle. I've seen videos, articles, even developers themselves say the only way to fix this is to skip space entirely. Just do fast travel, fade to black, run a cutscene, and pretend the journey doesn't exist. Now recently, Eurogamer did a whole piece on this, praising games that avoid space travel and spaceflight and holding up things like The Outer Worlds 2 as a better way forward. And here's the thing, they are absolutely right about Starfield, but they're completely and utterly wrong about space. Starfield then is not boring because of space, it's boring because of how it uses space, or rather how it doesn't use it. The ship then ends up as more or less a loading screen, or at times a mini-game or small distraction, and distances in space end up being just dead time. And the writing and missions don't support the fantasy that the game is trying to sell, and that fantasy is the lived experience of being in space. So what is the solution? Well, one that often gets praised is to do what The Outer Worlds does, and what The Outer Worlds 2 is continuing to do, which is to cut spaceflight out entirely and turn the ship into a menu and a set of cutscenes, the same sort of thing that we saw in Mass Effect. And the reason it gets praised is because it works. It works for very specific types of games and very specific types of RPGs. But if you care about space games as a genre, like I do, then that's not a solution. It's not even close. So in this video then, I want to take a look at what space games keep getting wrong, why this space is boring argument keeps coming back, and why I think the exact opposite is true. So let's start with Starfield, because that one's a biggie and it's the obvious example. Starfield tries a bit of everything. It's a loot game, it's an open world RPG, it's a base builder, a space game, a factions game, and many more things besides. You can just keep going here. But none of these parts really talk to each other, not in any meaningful way, and space is where it all really starts to fall apart the most. And that's because you don't really travel in space. Sure, you can move around a little bit in space environments, but if you want to go any distance, then you have to point at a marker, click a menu, get a cutscene, and then you're there. And whilst there's rumours that this may change, that Bethesda are going to release some type of update, and it's quite possible that by the time you've watched this video that update has released, I don't believe that fundamentally it's going to change the issue at hand. And that's because the ship really matters in the moment-to-moment gameplay. The distances don't mean anything, because the game doesn't attach any feeling or consequence to them. They're just numbers and loading screens, and that's pretty much that. So people come away from all of that and say, see, space travel is inherently boring. But Starfield isn't a proof that space travel is boring, that's the thing. Instead, it's proof that unconnected systems are boring. Another ship, regardless of how much you can influence it, how much you can design it and customize it, is still just a backdrop. And that, like other games, Starfield does show us that distance with nothing attached to it is still boring. And yes, the same thing still happens even when you hold up the Outer Worlds style approach as the fix. Ultimately, you just turn the ship into a hub, you fade to black, you jump to the next planet, job done. And again, that's fine for a game that never really pretends to be a space game or a true space sim. But it doesn't solve the fundamental problem, it just removes the very thing that makes space games special in the first place. Now, go compare that to No Man's Sky. Hello Games understand something very simple and very important. It's not really about the distance. It's about the ship, and it's about, more importantly, the feeling. Most of the time, you're not thinking in terms of kilometers or AU, you're thinking in terms of how quickly can I get into space? How does it feel in this ship when I punch the engines? And what do I see on the way there? The warp drive, the pulse engines, the way planets loom up in front of you, the little points of interest that appear as you travel. All of that is there to turn empty distance into a series of feelings, speed, anticipation, curiosity even. Elite Dangerous is a really interesting case here as another example, because it spent years stuck in what I'd call that distance trap. It meant you had a lot of long supercruise runs, something I complained about for a very long time. This could mean 7-minute flights to stations, sometimes even as much as a half hour. And that also meant that you had these huge realistic star systems where for a lot of players, not much actually happened along the way on your journey. And for some people, that scale is exactly what they wanted. It works for them, and that's the sim side of the genre. That is what space sims can very much be about. But for many others, the distance became a problem. It was distance for the sake of distance. It didn't always reinforce anything. And then Frontier added Super Cruise Overdrive, basically the ability to ramp up your speed almost instantly, and then you could feel immediately how that changed the relationship between distance and fun. Suddenly, the distance became relative to your ship, relative to what you could do on the way, and relative to how quickly you could switch from cruising to doing something interesting. Same game, same galaxy, but a completely different feeling. And yes, you may have noticed there's a few keywords I keep mentioning here: feeling and reinforcement. We'll get to those in just a moment, but keep an eye out because these are fundamental to what many developers are doing wrong when it comes to space. So yeah, that's the real point. Space is big, and yes, space is mostly empty. But video games don't have to obey those rules. In the real world, distance equals time and space equals emptiness. But in a game, neither of those have to be true. You can have instant acceleration, faster than light travel, gravity assists that feel more like a stunt than an equation, and slingshotting past suns and planets at ridiculous speeds. And emptiness can be a tool as well if you just use it to build mood instead of boredom. And that's exactly where the problem that Starfield ran into, and even to some extent Elite Dangerous as well at times. And don't get me wrong, they're not the only games that have made this mistake, but they are the perhaps most prevalent examples. These problems then come from assuming that if you just copy the shape of space, the big distances, the empty gaps, you'll somehow manage to automatically copy the feeling of space, the sense of awe, the sense of wonder, the sense of scale. But the truth is, just because you copy the description of a thing, it doesn't automatically give you the feeling of that thing. Now, Gabe Newell famously summed all of this up many years ago when he talked about fun not being realism, but instead reinforcement. He said, more or less, and I'm somewhat paraphrasing this, but I'll include the links in the video description because there's some very good articles there that I highly recommend you watch. But he said, I've never thought to myself, realism is fun. I play games to have fun. So at Valve, they started thinking about fun as the degree to which the game recognises and responds to your actions, not whether it was realistic, but whether the world acknowledged what you did. And he gives that example from Half-Life. If you shoot a wall and nothing happens, it feels like the world is ignoring you. But if you shoot the wall and a decal appears, or it otherwise gets damaged, or enemies react, suddenly you feel seen by the game. And that's what they mean by reinforcement. Now, if we take that concept and put it into space games, something very interesting starts to happen. So if you point your ship at a marker, hit a button, fade to black and arrive, the game hasn't acknowledged anything you did. There was no decision, no response, no reinforcement. The same is true if you just point your ship in a random direction and keep flying for dozens of minutes at a time. The game is not acknowledging you. But if instead you punch the engines and feel the ship strain, clip past a planet and get dragged a little by its gravity, get an unexpected signal on the way, see the cockpit react to your speed, you're still just travelling from A to B, but now the game is constantly saying to you that yes, this means something, I can feel what you're doing here, here's some feedback. And that's the difference between the space is boring and space feeling alive. And this all goes way beyond that, because space isn't just one thing, it's actually a bundle of different things to different people. And I do believe that this is why so many people, why there's so many arguments out there about space games, and all the people discussing this, well, they all talk past each other. And that's because, for some people, space is about science. And that's where Kerbal Space Program leans in. You got orbital mechanics, staging, engineering. It's all about understanding how things work. For others, it's about scale. And this is where Elite Dangerous is at its best. It sells that feeling of smallness, of being a tiny ship in a vast, uncaring galaxy. But for many people, space is about wonder, awe, mystery, the unknown, discoverability, isolation, terror, and many other things besides. And every single one of those words is a feeling that games can and do evoke. Flying in space in a video game isn't really about simulating space, unless you're playing a specific flight simulator, But if you're just playing a space game, then it's not just about that. Not any more so than walking in Skyrim is about simulating what it's like to hike through Scottish mountains for 6 hours. It's about taking the idea, the feeling that those places give you, and then designing the game to bring that out. And the thing is that there are plenty of modern space games that get this right, and you don't have to look that far to actually see it working. Everspace 2 is a good example. I'm often citing this because, in my opinion, it's one of the best space games out there. And it doesn't even try to be a hardcore space sim. It's very obviously an arcade-style dogfighting game, but it nails that feeling of being in a vast, agile ship out in the void. The game itself, the combat is punchy, the weapons feel very good indeed, and the environments are dense enough that you're always making small decisions. Things like you might be wondering, do I answer that distress call? Do I detour to this signal instead? Or should I risk another fight for a little bit more loot? And really, this means that in Everspace 2, space isn't empty. Instead, it's a playground for engagement. And then we have Chorus. This is a slightly different example, and it goes in a very different direction. It leans into the whole idea of science, strange structures, and almost supernatural maneuvers. You can warp, you can blink, you can curve through these huge spaces in what feels more like flying a cursed fighter than a realistic ship. But again, it's not about realism. It's about giving a movement and travel to a specific tone, isolation, cosmic weirdness, and power. No Man's Sky does something very similar with colour and density. Elite Dangerous, especially with the newer Overdrive system, does this with speed and scale. And then Kerbal does it with physics and problem solving. They all tap into very different parts of the same space fantasy. They bring to you the feeling of what those aspects are like. So why do so many big games keep getting it wrong? Well, when you step back, you may notice that a pattern starts to appear. The space games that struggle tend to be the ones that do one or more of the following. They treat space only as distance. They treat the ship as a menu, not a character or a living environment. They chase realism because it sounds good in marketing rather than because it reinforces anything, and they copy the shape of space, the size, the emptiness, but they don't attach feelings or systems to it. Whereas the games that succeed, even on a smaller budget, pick a feeling and then they build around it. You can have space as an engineering puzzle, or space as an endless dogfight, space as a lonely pilgrimage, space as a psychedelic nightmare. There's lots of different options out there, and many more besides. These are just a very few small examples. But they choose one of these, maybe a couple of them, and then they commit to recreating that feeling by their design decisions. And that's the bit that I feel a lot of AAA space games are scared of. It means choosing, and it means having a very specific point of view. It means that the developers have to say that this is what space is in our game, and then letting all the other things fall away. Space is many different things, but it can't be all of them in all games. Now, when I see people saying things such as space travel is boring, or suggesting that the answer is to cut it out completely, I don't think that's the problem with the space game genre or the space sim genre itself, and I don't think it is anything to do with space. I think it's a sign that the biggest games in space have been a bit too afraid of what makes it special. And here's the real deal, here's the thing. The fantasy of space is still there. In Elite Dangerous, when Overdrive kicks in and you escape the gravity well of one planet and zoom almost uncontrollably across a star system towards another world, and it grows from a speck to a massive huge ball. And in No Man's Sky, when you punch through the atmosphere, see 4 more planets hanging in the sky, or smaller games that never make the big headlines but quietly understand how to make a ship feel like home. The hard part isn't inherently necessarily the technology, and it certainly isn't budget. It isn't solving space. It all comes down to game design and game philosophy. It's choosing which part of that fantasy that you care about and then reinforcing it over and over until the player feels it without having to think about why. Unfortunately then, the space games keep getting it wrong. They get it wrong when they keep trying to be everything, and then ultimately they end up being nothing. Or at least nothing special and nothing in particular. But the games that get it right, the ones who are willing to say that this is what space means in our game, this is how it feels in this title, and this is where we're going to design everything else to back that up. And ultimately that means until more of the big games do this, I think the best examples of the genre will continue to come from the places that aren't afraid of space at all, and that's likely going to be the AA games and the indie studios. The places where they're not just trying to turn it into a loading screen, they're not just trying to sell you a product, they're not just trying to appeal to the widest possible audience. Instead, they're trying to sell you the feeling, a very specific feeling, of what space means to them. There is another video on screen right here, do check it out. Take care, and I'll catch you next time.